Imagine for a second an institution so powerful, so absolute, that it holds the keys to both heaven and earth. For centuries, that was the reality of the Roman Church. What we're going to dive into today is the story of how that power shattered, not from the outside, but from within, over 200 years, setting the stage for a revolution that would change the world forever. So that's the big question, right? How does a superpower just collapse from the inside out? For 1,000 years, the Roman Church was the authority in Europe, period. But it turns out its most dangerous enemy wasn't some invading army. Nope, it was a series of self-inflicted wounds, one crisis after another, that would trigger its own dramatic unraveling. And this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn crisis. This timeline gives us a great roadmap. It all kicks off in 1305, when the Pope basically becomes a political pawn. That leads to a massive split in the church. This crisis then inspires the very first calls for real reform, which get amplified by a technological revolution, the printing press, all building up to that one moment in 1517 when the whole system just ignites. To really get this collapse, you have to understand the world it happened in. For 1,000 years, Europe was built on this one single foundation, religious unity, all under one pope. But by the 1300s, that foundation was starting to crack under the weight of some massive societal changes. And it wasn't just one crack. It was more like a perfect storm of change. You had the Pope's power fading as powerful kings started building their own nations. The old feudal system was dying out, replaced by a new, wealthy middle class that was, frankly, more interested in making money than in going on crusades. And then, bubbling up through it all, was the Renaissance, a total rebirth of culture and intellect that was changing how people saw everything. So, the first and probably the most critical domino to fall was the authority of the papacy itself. And this wasn't an attack from the outside. This was a completely self-inflicted wound, a crisis of leadership that just shattered the Pope's prestige. It all started with something called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. In 1305, a French archbishop becomes pope. And what does he do? He moves the entire papal court to Avignon in France. For almost 70 years, the papacy was basically operating under the thumb of the French king. To the rest of Europe, the Pope started to look less like a universal spiritual leader and more like a French puppet. Now, you'd think moving the papacy back to Rome would fix things, right? Well, it made everything 1,000 times worse. The French cardinals, not wanting to lose their influence, just went and elected their own pope back in Avignon. So now Europe has two popes, both claiming to be the one true successor to St. Peter and both excommunicating the other one. Can you imagine being a regular person? Which pope is your ticket to heaven and which one is leading you to hell? It was pure spiritual chaos. And if you think two popes is absurd, just you wait. In 1409, a church council gets together to solve the problem. Their brilliant idea? Depose both popes and elect a brand new one. The only problem? The other two popes refused to quit. So now, you guessed it, the church had 3 popes. You just can't make this stuff up. I mean, this really gets to the heart of it. If the pope is supposed to be God's single representative on earth, but there are 3 guys all claiming the job, who are you supposed to follow? This whole mess dealt a massive, irreparable blow to the church's credibility. The damage was done. Now, while the church's authority was crumbling, this huge intellectual vacuum was created, and a powerful new movement was more than ready to fill it. We call it the Renaissance, the rebirth, and it represented this profound shift in focus, away from a world that was all about God to a world that started celebrating humanity. At its core, the Renaissance was about human potential. Thinkers started embracing humanism, focusing on human reason and what we could achieve. They championed individualism, celebrating the unique talents of a single person. And they promoted intellectualism, encouraging people to think critically and ask questions, instead of just blindly accepting what they'd always been told. This table really lays it out perfectly. Just look at the goal row. In the medieval world, the focus was all on salvation, on the afterlife. But during the Renaissance, that shifted to earthly pursuits, to finding fulfillment right here, right now. The ultimate authority wasn't just the church anymore. It was also human reason. This was a total revolution in how people saw their place in the universe. And the impact was just enormous. You see this explosion of art, a revival of classical learning, but maybe the most important invention for our story is Gutenberg's printing press around 1456. You gotta understand, this was the internet of its day. It was a game-changing piece of tech that allowed new and often radical ideas to spread faster and farther than ever before. Okay, so let's connect these two big trends. You've got this Renaissance ideal of going back to the original sources, and you combine that with this massive crisis in the papacy. It led scholars to start asking a very dangerous question. What did Christianity originally look like before all these layers of tradition and corruption were piled on top? This new way of thinking gives us what we call Christian humanism. Scholars like Erasmus use their skills to go back to the original texts, publishing the first ever printed Greek New Testament in 1516. And for the small circle of people who could actually read it, the conclusion was shocking. The huge, wealthy, political church of their day looked almost nothing like the humble, simple church they were reading about in the Bible. Even before Erasmus, this scholar at Oxford named John Wycliffe came to the exact same conclusion. He started arguing that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate spiritual authority, and his solution was totally radical for the time. Let's translate the Bible into English so that regular, ordinary people could finally read it for themselves and see how the church's teachings stacked up. And these ideas started to spread. Wycliffe's writings made their way from England all the way to Bohemia, what we'd call the Czech Republic today, and they fell into the hands of a really passionate pastor named John Hus. Hus started preaching Wycliffe's ideas in Prague, calling out church corruption and declaring that Christ, not some corrupt pope, was the true head of the church. So, how did the church leadership respond to this call for reform? Did they listen? Nope. They suppressed it. Hus was called to the Council of Constance, promised he'd be safe, but instead he was arrested, condemned as a heretic, and burned at the stake. But in killing him, all they did was create a martyr and fan the flames of dissent even higher. So let's pull all these different threads together for a second. What we've really been watching is a chain reaction. A crisis in leadership created a power vacuum. That vacuum was filled by powerful new ideas from the Renaissance. And those ideas, in turn, inspired the very first calls for religious reform. The stage was now perfectly set for a revolution. You can almost think of it like a recipe for revolution. The main ingredient? A weakened, corrupt papacy. Then you mix in some powerful kings who are eager to challenge the Pope. You add a generous amount of Renaissance humanism, sprinkle in the courage of early reformers like Wycliffe and Hus, and then you turn up the heat with the game-changing technology of the printing press. In the end, it really all comes down to this. The church had so many chances to fix itself. Scholars, mystics, early reformers, they all warned that things were on the wrong path. But, as one of our sources so perfectly puts it, the church's refusal to reform itself basically guaranteed that a revolution was coming. By the early 1500s, all the pieces were on the board. The corruption at the top was obvious. The intellectual arguments for a split were there. And the technology now existed to spread the message like wildfire. The fuse had been lit. The only question left was who was finally going to strike the match.